Hi everyone, and welcome today to our webinar, Bridging the Gap, Understanding the Candidate Experience by Generation. Today we have Elaine Orler from Talent Board, and I am Claire Alloway, and I am the Marketing Manager here at Jobvite. Before we get started and I pass everything over to Elaine, I just wanted to give you a couple of details about the webinar. If we can move to the next slide. So first of all, you'll notice all your lines are muted just to avoid the background noise, but we would love to have you ask any questions during the presentation and afterwards. So please use the chat box in the GoToWebinar control panel to type those in. I'll be checking throughout the presentation, and then we will have time at the very end of the presentation. So if you don't hear your question answered, stay tuned for the end, and we will hopefully get to all of them depending on how long the presentation is. And the last thing I wanted to go over was the fact that we are recording this webinar, and we will be sending out the full recording after the presentation. So if you have to drop off quickly, if you love what Elaine is sharing and you want to share it with your coworkers, you will have that opportunity. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Elaine to get started.
Thank you so much, and I am excited to be here because this is such a interesting and fun dynamic topic. I've had more conversations than not about what is the recruiting difference between millennials, baby boomers, and all the other categories in between and on the edges. And I appreciate the fact that you've given an opportunity for me to talk about it. So first, let me give a little bit of intro to myself and the organization that I'm representing today. My name is Elaine Orler, as you guys have all heard. I've been in the industry now for just over 20 years. I've focused my entire career, my professional career, around talent acquisition, recruiting, predominantly getting the process equation and the technology equation right. And I spend my time equally split between two organizations, Talent Function as a consulting firm focused on the talent acquisition equation, and Talent Board, a nonprofit entity that I founded and established with Ed Newman and Jerry Crispin just about 5 years ago. And the intention for the Talent Board was to really create an entity where we could talk about what's happening from a candidate experience perspective, where we could collect data, where we could deliver benchmarking results, where organizations that were interested in participating and understanding where they fit in the equation could absolutely benchmark without risk of being exposed if they weren't doing a great job, but also creating a platform for awards for companies that really are treating their candidates with respect. And much like I'll talk about how the award process works, those organizations deserve to be recognized for those efforts. So as a couple of key facts to the program, we have a little over 160,000 candidate experience surveys in the last 4 years in North America. The interesting thing to note, last year we had 95,000 candidate surveys. We're in the midst of our process for North America today, and I just checked the data, and we have a little over 14,000 candidate responses, and the surveys have really only been open about 2 weeks. So we are taking predictions on how many surveys we'll have this year from the overall program, but I've heard the general trend is around 120,000. So it'll be interesting data to see if there's been any changes from last year's data. Meaning the data that we're going to talk about on this webinar is clearly from our 2014 data sets and not from the 2015 data yet, but I think you're going to find it very applicable. As a program, we actually have 3 regional efforts going on right now. Our North America program, if you have never participated, we are still offering the benchmark process where you can self-benchmark your organization, or you can choose to benchmark against your candidate data as well. And I'm happy to provide more insight into at the end of the webinar on how to do that. We also have our EMEA program running open until August 1st, and then our APAC program will be open until October 1st, with the awards being announced anywhere between a month and 2 months after each of those close dates. But the important thing to tell you just from a talent board perspective is the activities and the efforts that any employer takes on in this program are completely free. We offer the benchmark data for free, the survey analysis tools for free, because we think it's important as corporations that we get to the bottom line results that we need in order to drive change in our organizations. So that provides us the benchmark data to talk about what we're doing from a global expansion perspective. And having already talked through the 3 major efforts, we are looking at taking the program into Latin America in 2016. But really this year has been about a global expansion into EMEA and APAC. So you'll be hearing a lot more data from us as an organization on even the trends generationally as well as geographically. So not just North America, but what are the difference in trends between North America, Europe, Asia, and are there differences from a candidate experience and expectation even by generation? And those are some of the reports we plan to bring forward this year from the program. So as I take you through this journey, and again, thank you for joining us, the journey is going to be about the data set that we have from 2014, and specifically the data that we have from North America. And we had a little over 95,000 candidate responses in North America. That was generated because we had over 200 companies register for the award program last year, and that was the base round benchmark as well as the candidate survey process. Round 1 is our benchmark processing for employers. There's about 60 questions that each employer is responsible for responding to and answering, and you're immediately given the opportunity to have that benchmark data against the aggregate total and against the winner sets and as part of your results. So do you want to compare how many resources you have in talent acquisition, how many candidates each recruiter is responsible for, requisition loads, the way in which you're organized and structured? All of that information is captured and benchmarked in round 1. Round 2 is what I call the People's Choice Award component, and that's where each employer is responsible for sending the survey links out to their candidates to invite their candidates to participate in our survey. Employers deliver the survey, we collect the results. From that round 2, that is what generated the 95,000 candidate responses, and from those responses, based on the candidate scores, and very importantly, truly based on the candidate scores across anywhere between 10 and 15 different markers out of 60 plus questions the candidates might be asked to respond to. We had 62 winners from last year's data, and as I talk through what's going to happen from the data sets and the overall analysis, I just want you to understand these are the organizations that have won the award in 2014. Each of these organizations, regardless of size, regardless of brand, regardless of recruiting model and delivery, demonstrated to their candidates, and their candidates validated back that they were worthy of the award because of a positive experience. So excited again to recognize each of these organizations as we do a lot of our articles and our events and our conference, our annual conference. These are the organizations you can expect to have presenting on the different things that they're doing, where they're striving. And one thing that's really interesting to note is as I talk to most of these organizations, in fact, I was just saying, none of them believe that they've arrived. All of them are somewhat surprised that they've won and have huge initiatives and efforts to continue to improve their candidate experience, and I think continue to push the bar up even higher on what's expected and how we should be treating candidates going forward in the industry. But to dive into the topic of choice and the important topic that we have for today, I wanted to do a couple of things to set the stage. And first and foremost, I want to recognize the fact that we actually have 5 generations in the workforce now. There's some data out there that says that, there are 4. There are others that say that, some of these are overlapping. But as we've defined each of these generations for our program, we actually do see a very almost perfect bell curve on the candidate population. This is the candidates that are in a job search capacity. They've either applied to an organization, they're considering applying to an organization, or they might have gone through the full recruiting steps and either been selected or not selected. And what we find is that there are 5 generations still in the job search. The focus for today is really around where there are some core differences, and I'm going to focus most of my energy on the baby boomer, Generation X, and millennials. But I want to call out where there's a difference with Generation Z, and specifically Generation Z because of the dates in which they were born. So understanding the group that we're going to focus on, 95,684 total responses, the three categories and the primary bulk of the candidate population we have. And the data we'll talk about is coming from 17,465 baby boomers, or designated, recognized as self-selected baby boomers, a little over 24,000 Generation X resources candidates, and then a little over almost 18,000 Generation Y. And the Generation Y, which are the millennials, the date range here goes to 1995. In our program as well, 1996 is what we consider Generation Z. The reason for that is because when our program started, and the fact that most of those candidates are just barely 18 or just within, and even younger than 18. So there is a slightly different expectation still for those that have not yet completed college or might be working through college and through high school. So we've categorized them as Generation Z for our program. But for the efforts in the conversation, we're going to focus on these three major groups, and we're going to dive into the specifics and some of the details around each of these groups and where the data falls. As you were told before as well, if you have questions or you have questions throughout, please feel free to ask them in the question section. We will be moderating the questions. We'll do our best to answer them as we go through, but we also left some time at the end for some overarching questions and the ability to go back and forth. And also look for feedback if information that I'm giving you is not what you're looking for. Let us know. There may be some other conversational points that we can add to this as I go forward. But some general facts just to get you set up for, again, the candidates that responded to our survey process and the candidates that are in the data sets that I'm covering going forward. We asked some key questions of each of the candidates overall. And one of the key things I look for is making sure that we're not just analyzing candidates that were hired, but we're also analyzing candidates that were not selected for positions or have made different decisions throughout their process. So in this first chart on the left-hand side, what you find is by each of the three categories, boomers, Generation X, and millennial, well, the candidate volumes are fairly similar across each of the categories, with the exception of those that said that they accepted an offer. But what we see here is that the majority of the candidate population data that we have said that the last step they completed was the application process, and they had not yet proceeded to other stages in the recruiting process. So what that tells me is these are folks that have not yet been accepted or candidates that have been told that they're not being considered at this point and were not offered. So we're looking at about an 85% overall of candidate population that were not hired to a 15% overall that were hired. So in this case, we really are looking at those candidates that were interested in your organization, but for whatever reason, as an organization, they weren't the right fit for the position in which we hired. The second thing I found is a fascinating, just a starter point, is we asked an initial question to all the candidates. What was their overall experience? So rate their overall experience in the process. And this is one that would be worthy of more discovery on our part, just breaking them down by the generational components. The millennials rated their overall experience much higher in the recruiting process than the baby boomers and even Generation X did. In fact, the boomers, there's a definite curve here, but those that were, and like I said, the boomers in age perspective, but probably in maturity in career and profession, found their experiences to be consistently more negative than the candidates that had a positive, and were the millennials said they had a positive experience. There's a lot of factors that go into this, and I'm not stating this as the end-all be-all to the fact, but it draws a correlation that there is a different level of expectation based on years of experience, based on years in the industry, based on the job types in which people are applying to, that we do need to take into consideration as employers. And that being, based on the generation we're trying to recruit, what are we doing to map to what their preferences are to make sure that they are having an above a 3-star, 3 being a neutral, but 3 to a 5-star experience, regardless of their generation, regardless of their position and type. So that's going to be an area where we talk about in a couple of the next slides going forward. Another thing that came across and was important is a question that we consistently ask year over year is, which statement best describes the relationship that you had as a candidate with an organization? And there's two primary categories. I had a relationship actually encompasses multiple things. It could be that they said that they were an advocate of the organization, they have family and friends that work there, they're a customer of the organization, or they are a follower of the brand or identity. So those were multiple categories that turned into the yes, I have a relationship. And we gave one category which the candidate said they had no relationship. And while there aren't any major differences here, what's interesting to note is the millennial population overall, and again, this is just short of about 18,000 candidates. Baby boomers was also close to 18,000 candidates. But more of the millennials actually reference the fact that they felt they had a relationship with the company. Some of this is derived by the fact of the type of position in which they applied to. We looked at the position type from professional to hourly to non-hourly, craft worker, manufacturing, executive, and seasoned professional. And there is a fairly solid correlation to the type of position they applied to and the generation they're in. But to find that majority of the millennials actually were establishing what they felt like was more of a relationship with the organization. The interesting thing to point out with this, just to keep in caveat, is if you, I'll leave you with, I work on each of these webinars to also state a couple of key points you should take away to think about. And this will be the first major key point, and that is that you have to assume that every other person that comes to your website to consider an opportunity with the organization feels they have a relationship with you already, and every other person that comes to your website feels that they don't have a relationship with you. What we find in a lot of the websites, the career experience, is the candidates that feel they have a relationship don't have a different path from the candidates that don't. And I think it's a huge opportunity for us as organizations to think about what is the person type that's coming to our jobs, who are we recruiting to our organization, and what is their impression. If they feel they're already a customer of ours, how are we taking them through the candidate experience that helps to extend that customer experience? Or if they're coming to our organization and they know nothing about us, or they're representing the fact that they don't know anything about our organization, what are we doing within our content and our navigational opportunities with these candidates to make sure that they're given the information they need to convert to somebody that feels like they have a relationship with us? So as the first point, just to be thinking about, you do have at least two primary candidate types, regardless of generation, that are hitting your website. And how we communicate with them is going to make a big difference on their overall experience. So to take us into some of the core details and some of the meat of each of these aspects, I started with two major categories and taking a look at where the differences lie. The first between marketing and research. So what is the information and how are we getting that information to the candidate types? And the second area we're going to talk about is the application. How are they getting their information to us as they apply through the process? And then we'll talk a little bit more about the social aspect and the footprint on how candidates are communicating their experience beyond the boundaries of just emails to their friends. So first and foremost, from the list below, we have several different categories where we ask the candidates to pick up to 5. And what I did here is I actually excluded the Generation X from this equation just to really focus on the difference between boomers and millennials. What you should know is that the Generation X actually falls somewhere in the middle of each of these. They're almost perfect stepping blocks across the board. But where I wanted to call out where we started to see some differences and something worthy of note in the percentage differences are in a couple of different areas between what I might call traditional versus becoming fast and more deliberate the recruiting efforts and tools that we're using today. So it's very clear that the corporate career site, and let me caveat one other thing, the percentages here are actually a direct correlation of the percentages within category. So the baby boomer percentages with a couple of additional smaller percentages would add up to 100%, and the millennials would add up to 100%. If you took out the percentage score on the side and we talked about where everything was as a total, company career site is well over 98% selected by all groups. So it is one of the highest aspects. It's one of the areas where candidates said they found the most value in researching the company. We find a big striking difference is in job notifications or job agents. So that ability to be pushed information, the baby boomers are relying on that much more than the millennials are today. And where we saw a flip and a little bit more of an increase is where we're seeing employer reviews, those third-party employer reviews, so Glassdoor, Vault, Great Rated, Indeed, etc., where candidates and the millennials are doing a little bit more external research, looking at what's happening within these organizational aspects prior to applying, but using that as part of their overall aspect of determining if they even have an interest in the company. If you look across the board, the top 5 for both groups are predominantly the same. The career site, the job notifications, LinkedIn pages has become very strong for, again, professional-based hires or the baby boomer generation to get more information. And then additional online groups, whether it be a LinkedIn specific group, a Yahoo group, Google Plus, has great strength. Where we do see in the third point here some additional differences falls in the mobile career site and apps. And we're starting to see, again, I think this is the true difference between what I would consider a digital native and a digital immigrant. And as we think about the millennials today, these are true digital native candidates. They were raised in an environment where cell phones were common, and tablets and laptops were very common. And I myself am a digital native. I remember life before remote control. I do remember life with a black and white TV that had antennas, for some of you that might be laughing on mute. But the reality being that there is starting to be a difference between the expectation on experience on how we deliver our recruiting process via mobile, via usability, and then and I call it device agnostic. Some of the other categories on this slide really are correlation to specifically the campus and the college, which also made much more sense when it comes to the millennial-based hiring. But the true call-outs, I think, to understand where are we setting up notifications or agents for those that want to be kept informed, and where are we keeping our information and monitoring our reputation outside of our own organization so that we can understand what other candidates are actually starting to learn about us and get in front of that reputation. In the second area where I really compared just 2 other core data sets from the differences in the 2 groups, and again, not a huge difference. If there's one thing, if I tell you the second thing that's going to come through in this entire survey and conversation is the fact that there seems to be this opinion that there is a radical difference between each generation and what they're expecting in the job search or the workforce. And what we consistently find is the baseline is there's a radical similarity in every group in what they're expecting and how they're expecting to be treated in the recruiting process. Millennials are gravitated more towards the technology, the notifications, their ability to do research. The boomers are gravitating a little bit more towards the conversation and their ability to have the technology-based updates. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of similarity in the expectation. Everybody is putting themselves out there for an interview, putting themselves out there to be considered by the organization. And the comments that we get from the candidates, and I should caveat, with 95,000 candidate responses, we offered at least 5 to 7 different places for them to do write-in comments. And in most cases, at least half of the candidates wrote in comments at least twice. So we have hundreds of thousands of write-in comments that we've gleaned from, and the attitude and the disposition of each of the candidates is very similar across all generations. But when we talked about the content that was most important, one of the areas where we are starting to see a correlated difference is the difference in what information is most important to the generation. And I will also caveat that I don't believe that this is rocket science. It makes complete sense to me. But it's also one of those things where I ask organizations to really think about how are you presenting the information on your own website? How are you catering to the candidate's expectations and needs in the content that you're presenting? Or are you presenting universal single line of content regardless of type? And you may or may not be connecting with the right candidates if you're not thinking about the information that's most relevant to them. And in this case, we did see with values as strong for all groups and categories, obviously, stronger for the millennials in their overall percentage. And we continuously see products and service information, so really company performance information still being more important to the baby boomers. And I think for obvious reasons, the company performance and longevity can have a greater impact on those that have a stronger or multi-year profession. And the millennials are looking at where's an environment where I'm going to actually be able to operate and function and contribute to, and perhaps not stay as long because I'm going to be looking at other opportunities while I go through this process. What was interesting is the percentages, again, overall were up to 5. So these are forced rank percentages based on the number of times they were selected within each category. And not surprising as to the top areas where there's a difference in each of the overarching expectations. But I was excited to see is that the employee testimonials and why people want to work here were valuable to all generations across the board. And yet there are so many times and places where we're missing the mark on the marketing content that we could be giving our candidates if we just think about how to move this content to the front, because it's generational agnostic. Everybody wants to know why do people want to work here, and what are the employees saying about their work environment. I think also each generation wants to validate that that's true, and that's part of the ability to look at external data sources, like again Indeed or Glassdoor, to validate what the employees are really saying. But those are important markers as we go forward. On the flip side of this chart, outside of just the marketing content, we asked them very specifically what's the most relevant job content. So what was the most important that they needed to do in order to really move them to applying for the process. And not surprising, there's very, very consistent similarities here. All generations want the salary range and compensation structure. They're looking for this information. And to coin a phrase from Jerry Crispin, and I think I'll probably butcher it, but where else on the internet can you go to a consumer purchase-based model and not know the price of something you're going to buy and price of something that you're willing to invest in? And in this case, we publish these job descriptions, and we publish all the content related to the job, but we still, as most organizations, do not disclose salary, do not disclose compensation, yet it's such a viable part of the decisioning process for all candidates. But the important piece being everybody still relies on the job description. Now, on the flip side, I could say that as an industry, our job descriptions need a lot of work. But that's what the candidates are relying on in order to make a decision to whether they're going to actually apply to a position or not. And the other things here, obviously, consistent to what we probably are seeing in other research reports and other market trend data. I did like the fact that we're seeing a little bit of a change difference between the employee day and the life, and that job overview component goes back to those employee testimonials, and the millennials felt that was a little bit stronger or more important than overall than the baby boomers. But as a percentage, it's still job description and salary data that's critical to all groups. As I move into the second process, because that's just some of the marketing content, the key piece there is just to remember a couple things. Are you targeting your marketing to each generation and their needs? Are you taking your marketing efforts and thinking about the fact that every other person that comes to your website already feels they have a relationship with you? And how do you cater to that experience and move them forward versus those that feel they don't know you at all and cater their experience to move them forward? And then as you do that, are you taking into consideration the important aspects of each of the data sets that they're looking for, whether it be company performance and stability, or whether it be the vision and the opportunity to really understand how other people feel about or are performing in their job. All of those factors are the baseline for a positive candidate experience. And as we take it forward, we're really going to think about, I'm going to show some of the differences between the apply process and what's happening from the candidates on this aspect. And this is to take from the picture on the side, and it's quoted at the bottom. For many of you may or may not be watching American Ninja Warrior challenges, or in my case, I go back to the ABC series of Wipeout, and you can probably envision in your mind the number of people that have been punched or fallen off of devices or things that have moved them into the water. And I always wonder if that isn't our candidate experience in the industry today. But as we think about the apply process, there's so many aspects that go into that process for candidates, and even just getting through the hoops that we've given them to complete their application and to use another Jerry phrase, throw their hat in the ring. A couple of data points just to call out from the correlation. As I said before, we talked about what types of jobs the candidates were applying to. I did want to call out here from an apply process. We did see, obviously, there's a definite correlation and difference between the millennials and where they feel they're applying to a professional position of 2+ years experience versus an hourly wage position, and substantially less millennials applying to a management position. What was consistent is that the Generation X and baby boomers are competing for all the same positions, almost at the exact same percentage levels. So from that aspect, we just see those volumes coming through. Tied to that, we actually asked the candidates some very important questions around the application process. And regardless of the application type, we asked them how long does it take them on average to complete the application. And this is everything from I'm initiating whether it be a profile or submitting a resume, all the way through until they receive that receipt that said, thank you so much for your application, we've received it. And the candidates on average across all generations, what you can see from this bottom is the average time it takes to apply is anywhere from between 16 and 60 minutes. So that time duration, we're asking the candidates, every one of our candidates are investing anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour just to apply to a single position per company. And that time investment is huge when you think about candidates applying to 3, 4, and 5 jobs in the course of a week. This is not just the unemployed candidate population. This is the candidate population that's looking for their next step, or the candidates that might be underemployed and looking for the right fit opportunity. But that's a huge investment on their time to complete all the hoops that we've asked them to complete as employers. And I always will ask this question, and from a very specific perspective, I think every organization needs to ask themselves this question. If your candidates are going to invest anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour to apply to your organization, and our typical recruiter company investment back to the majority of our candidates is less than 90 seconds, time to skim the resume or an auto disposition based on the fact that they didn't pass an assessment, do we feel that that formula and equation is right? A candidate that walks away after spending an hour with an automatic message that says thanks but no thanks, what kind of experience do we think we're giving them? And I think it's an opportunity for us as an industry to really take a step back and say, what is the most important aspect of the information we need at the application stage to make this equation a little bit closer to neutral? And some organizations have taken this to the point of if they gave every candidate back the equal amount of time they gave, there would never be any time to recruit or hire anybody. So I'm not stating as an industry that we have to go back and say for every hour a candidate gives us, we equal an hour back. But I do think it's worth considering and always considering what is the application process that we have in our organization. How much time are we asking them to spend, and how much of that time is invested versus wasted from a candidate perspective and a recruiter's ability to review the data and information that was submitted. So you have to ask yourself, how much time does it take to apply to your organization? So point number 2, major point, if you've not done a mystery shopper experience on your own recruiting aspect, I encourage every person to do that. Take the time it's going to take, because I can't say it's going to take 5 minutes. It could take you an hour. Take the time it's going to take and mystery shop your own recruiting experience. Go to your website, apply to a job, submit your resume, complete all the tasks, time yourself. And once you time yourself doing that at a desktop or a laptop environment, do the same thing with your mobile phone or tablet and time yourself. You will walk away with more ideas on things that you need to do to improve your candidate experience that we could never possibly deliver in a survey or even in a webinar, because that experience alone will give you a feel for what's happening in there just from the time perspective. And I say that because I do think we need to narrow scope the time and really think about the activities that candidates are completing. But at the same time, I'm going to tell you that we did a correlation of the candidate's overall experience just based on time, and there was no major difference in their overall rating. The difference came if they didn't feel they could adequately present their experience. So we asked a separate question in this one stated here. How satisfied were they with the ability to present their skills, knowledge, and experience during the process? And the candidates overall that said satisfied or extremely satisfied had no correlation or disparate correlation to whether it took them 60 minutes or 15 minutes in the process, because the more important piece was their ability to present themselves. Now, this came back in information on the flip side. Those that were extremely dissatisfied were the ones that spent that amount of time but didn't feel like they could adequately describe or present themselves for the asking an ended question in the process. Is there anything else related to your skills and abilities that we haven't asked that would benefit us to know about your ability to perform the function of the job for which you're applying? And a concept where you can actually collect that information is starting in a secondary movement to reconsider what we've done with the cover letters, because we've often, in most of our technology, moved the cover letter to a secondary attachment nobody looks at. But in essence, the cover letter in the original intention was for a candidate to be able to describe how they might best fit that position while they attach their resume. So there's an opportunity for us as organizations to really think about keeping our candidates satisfied. If you need to keep your application process along, really have to ask yourself if you, at the end of the process, you felt that they could adequately present themselves. I'll give a quick shout out to a couple of millennials. I have a millennial. We have 4 generations in our household, and as both of my college-bound kids were looking for summer jobs, both of them experienced a satisfied and a very dissatisfied ability to present their skills and abilities. One of them was taken through an assessment process of 140 plus questions where they needed to describe whether they strongly agreed or strongly disagreed, and all of this was in order to be a sandwich maker. And the other one was redirected to take an assessment that required a Social Security number to submit, yet was never required to submit their Social Security number before, so the page would never load. And as we went through the discussion and the process on this, these are some of the things that we can think about as organizations on what steps and hoops are we really asking our candidates to jump through, and knowing the candidates are willing to do them if they can get to this outcome. If at the end the questions were relevant to the job, the process steps were relevant to the position, they had an ability to explain what they were doing in the process, we're going to have a much stronger and positive candidate experience in the long run. Even the candidates that aren't selected or hired are going to declare that they had a better experience. And taking that experience and communicating it, we're going to talk a little bit about what's happening in the market. You have candidate types that have a positive experience, and then you have candidates that have expressed the fact that they've had an extremely negative experience. And specifically with the generational perspective, those candidates, we asked them very specific questions. We asked them questions around how they communicate with their inner circle, how they communicate with the social media in general. And not surprising, but I'll caveat these out. The inner circle, in all cases, in all generations, the average was somewhere between 4 and 6 people they felt was in their inner circle. Now, in the first year that we did this, we thought for sure every follower on Instagram was going to be counted as an inner circle for the millennials, and in fact, it's not true. They stay very close to the 4 to 6 ratio, just like every other generation. Those core components being whether be a professor, a strong advisor, a family member, a former mentor, etc. And so in those cases, the millennials and the boomers were communicated that they were most likely and most likely to communicate a positive experience, the top line, 85% of the time or 76% of the time. So almost 9 out of 10 millennials will talk about a positive experience with their inner circle. Almost 8 out of 10 boomers will talk about a positive experience with their inner circle. On the flip side, in 6.5, I can say that, between 6 and 7 in both generations will talk about a negative experience with their inner circle. Where I thought we would find radical differences, and we do see a trend difference happening in the positive and not so much in the negative, is in the social communication. Millennials, 5 out of 10 of them said that they would share something publicly positively about their recruiting experience. And this is very specific to their recruiting experience with that organization. So you have to think every other millennial might say something positive. That's a huge push and a bump to your brand, to your organization, to the impressions about your organization. And boomers really at 45%. So we do see a slight difference there in growth of how much is being willing to be said socially and publicly. But what we also found in the data is that nobody really wants to go out and in a massive group talk about the negative. In both categories, 3 out of 10 candidates said that they would share a negative experience publicly. Now that actually, 3 out of 10 is still a large percentage, and it's a risk to all of our organizations we have to think about. But I'm more inclined to look at how do I get the 4 and 5 out of 10 to say something positive? Because if I get more of those to communicate how great it was, the sound of those that are talking about a negative experience becomes less and less. And so there's a huge opportunity for us as organizations to think about what are we doing to drive that communication that experience is going to be shared. We need to go into the process knowing it's going to be shared. It's not that they're going to keep it confidential, but how do we make sure that at the outcome, the end of the process, that the candidate can actually say something positive, that we've treated them with respect and worthy of a conversation on the positive markers. Just to correlate both of those, so you understand the actual data from the overall, all generational data was very, very similar. What we did see is a huge leap difference between 2012 and 2014 data, where a lot more of the candidates in 2013 and 14 have consistently started to say that they're going to share more. So, and I think that has a lot to do with the industry and just the market as a whole as we become much more collaborative individuals, and as we become more comfortable with social media across all the generations. I think we're only going to continue to see these percentages increase, and hopefully only increase on the positive, and the negative components happen that candidates are being mitigated in other ways. And I know that we're running up on just about quarter till, so I want to take you through the last 2 to 3 slides. And I'm interested to know we're going to have some questions, so we'll open it up for questions in just a few minutes. But as the last components overall, regardless of generation, and this is really just focused on candidates that we asked a secondary set of questions. We said, give us your overall rating, and it was one of the first markers within their survey. And of the 95,000, in this case, there's 27,000 candidates I'm using as a source data. We said if you gave it candidates that gave their overall process of 5 stars, 65% of those candidates said that they were likely to increase their relationship with the company. So these are candidates that said they had an amazingly great experience overall, regardless of generation. 65% of them said that they are going to find some way to increase their relationship with the company. These are candidates that are also not hired. This is still based on the 85% of the candidates not being hired by the organization, but still had a 5-star experience, so that they would find a way to make their alliance or the product purchases or whatever that relationship even stronger. Similar to note, the candidates that actually stated that they had a 1-star experience, the worst, an extremely negative experience, 40% of those candidates said that they will do something to take their decision and purchase power somewhere else. Those candidates drive directly into resentment factors very quickly. And so I think you have to ask yourself as an organization too, what is the impact on a candidate, on your business, to have a candidate that's willing to become a stronger advocate, or a candidate that's willing to go out of their way to deter somebody else, or to make sure that they're not doing anything to support your organization. On a similar note, we also asked, because the key areas where it becomes part of our recruitment brand and effort was the willingness to refer a friend. And we looked across the overall core data set here as well. The 5-star versus the 1-star. Obviously, candidates that almost 80% of the candidates that had a 5-star experience said that they were extremely likely, would actively encourage others to apply. And again, these are candidates that were not hired. These are just candidates that were treated well. If they had a 5-star experience, they were extremely likely to encourage others to apply. How amazing would that be from our recruiting efforts if we could tap into the candidate referrals, not just employee referrals, but these relationships that are going to become stronger advocates to our efforts and our recruiting mindset. And then again, obviously on the flip side, we also saw that 40% of the candidates that said they had a terrible experience would go out of their way to discourage others. And in some cases where we're looking at very targeted industry individuals, where there's a small subset of people that we need to recruit for our business that are critical, if there's 15 people in the industry that know how to do what you need them to do, and you've got one person in this category, you've lost the ability to get to a lot of the other 15 based on their relationships. If you have one person in the extremely positive, you most likely will get the rest of the candidates you need without much effort. So it's something to think about, and again, how that experience has an implication on your ability to recruit long term. And the last is those candidates, again, that are critical to us as businesses, likeliness that they would apply again. And those that had 5-star experience, positive experience, almost 80% of them said that it was rewarding and they would apply again. And in those cases, again, they may not have been the right fit for the right job, but if they are cultural fit, it's just a matter of time before you find the opportunity. And so this is a huge ability for us to re-recruit the people that we've spent a lot of time and invested in, but just may not have been the perfect fit. But at the same time, we might have done everything we possibly could for that perfect candidate, but if they had a terrible experience, we may never get them back. And knowing that not only not get them back, but they're going to influence others to not consider us is equally a challenge and something for us to remember as we go forward in the industry. So those are a lot of the notes, just to quickly summarize. And I think we've got a couple of questions, or I hope we have some questions. And what I'd like to do is just say that there are some minor differences that are trending through the data. I think overall, those that are in professional-based roles have been in the industry longer, or have their career path through the Generation X and the baby boomer aspect, have a little bit more importance in the allegiance to the company performance, the overall performance, and an expectation on the communication aspects that are going to happen with them. On the flip side, with the millennials, they're not that much different. They are looking for the same types of values that we all look for in the job search. They're spending the same amount of time applying that each other generation is spending applying, and they're just slightly more likely to communicate a positive experience exponentially and publicly, which I think can be a huge benefit and a win for our organizations if we can find a way to better tap into those experiences with them. So with that, I will pause to see what questions we have, if there's anything you need to answer.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Elaine, for that great presentation. There's so much information in there. We do have some questions. I will start off with Katie. She asks, what are some of the new trends that you're seeing that organizations are actually using to enhance the candidate experience?
Oh, great question. New trends that organizations are using. I think the word du jour for probably 2014 and 15 was transparency. And I think a lot more organizations have really taken an approach, and especially the companies that have been much more on the forefront of winning this award and other awards, around making commitments to their candidates. We've seen the Candidate Bill of Rights, the Candidate Communication Policy. Organizations are putting themselves out there and saying that they're going to commit to a response or feedback within a certain window of time and delivering on those promises. And much like consumer-based organizations, when they need support or follow up on different types of things, I would say one of the biggest trends to moving in a positive direction have been the companies that have stated that it's now part of the recruiter performance review on what kind of communication's been, how their candidates have been handled, what their candidate sentiment scores are. So those are probably some of the most exciting in my mind.
Great. Annabelle asked, what about Generation Z? How different will recruitment need to be? And I know the sample size is a little bit smaller, but maybe you're seeing some trends that might develop in the next couple of years?
Yes, it is interesting. And I think right now the sample size for us it's smaller. It's still statistically valid, but for me, given the volume numbers that we have in the other categories, I don't count it as valid yet. But a couple of the core areas, they are a little bit higher than the millennials on their trending for social communication. They're right in that same category, but the percentage numbers that we have overall to do the comparison, I don't, again, I can only say what I think anecdotally is going to be the case. The second thing that we're seeing within that population is a definite more allegiance to mobile in the apply process with mobile. And the third area is and I didn't talk about the category here, but really how candidates are identifying with and finding the jobs that they're looking for. We do see with the baby boomers and the Generation X a predominant allegiance and alliance to like a LinkedIn search or LinkedIn relationship and networking, where we see with the millennials and specifically the Generation Z, a lot more broader social searching. So their profiles are caveated more towards a Google or a Yahoo or a Bing search for jobs, and much more of an organic connectivity to the job search versus a traditional model that the other generations are more tied to. But those are pretty much at the very, very high level and only off by a couple of different, a few percentage points at this avenue. I do expect in the next 3 to 5 years, as we see more candidates from Generation Z, there's also an industry push to move Generation Z back into millennials, because each generation should have a 20-year window on average. And right now, millennials are 10, and Generation Z is kind of that second half of the 10. So not exactly sure where that category is going to go yet.
We'll have to see how it shakes out in the future. So Lynn had a question about maybe some of the CandE Award winners specifically, or in your own experiences. Are you seeing video conferencing or video interviewing increasing and being well received?
That's a great question. In fact, we do ask the questions through the interview process, and I would also caveat for anybody that's interested, we do put together a fire hose report that's free for anybody to download from the website, and there's a whole section in there on the differences that are happening within the interview and the expectations of interview. And a lot more organizations are aligned with using more of the more mainstream tools. So video today, mobile as a baseline versus, a device agnostic kind of capabilities are much more predominant in the winning organizations. And in fact, the disposition of being able to use video, from whether it be a cover letter to a pre-screening questions to a dynamic real-time interview kind of model, video is absolutely predominant in a lot of the winning organizations.
Wonderful. So Natasha asked, she was curious about whether you had any insights on the broken down by gender rather than by generation or age.
So we do. That should be another webinar. We actually have, we've started to look at the same thing within each of the requirements. There's not enough call outs that I could use on the call today, but that's actually a good point. Maybe I should do my next article on that one as well, because we do ask for gender. One of the key things in areas we do get asked a lot is if there's a difference between those that are unemployed versus those that are employed in the recruiting efforts. And we choose not to ask that question. We don't ask any disability questions or veteran preference questions or true EEO data. Part of the survey process is to really keep it away from any of those government compliant-based issues that we all face in-house as recruiters. So this year we have added a couple of questions around whether they were an employee already, so that we can differentiate between internal versus external recruiting efforts. And we're asking we've asked some questions around how long candidates have been in their job search. But short answer is we do have the data on the difference between gender, but I don't have it queued up right now to give you any of the examples.
Okay, great. Erica has a question. Do you see any correlation with how many rounds of interviews candidates are going through and the candidate's overall recruiting experience?
There is some correlation to that. We have found some of those pieces to come through. It is not so much around the round of interviews that we've seen in candidate disposition as it is around the intention and the quality of the interview. one of the greatest frustration points for all the candidates in their candidates from that interview stage was the fact that they felt that their time was disrespected. Candidates that gave it a one star, so the worst experience possible, was because that they felt that their time was disrespected. And that came about in some of the most fascinating ways. Things that if we just applied common sense and respect to the process, as recruiters, we would all be shocked at the things that happen. But from the moment in time that the candidate spends all the time researching the company, being prepared to interview with the manager, to interview with a certain set of people, only to have those people no-show and someone else backfill, who, as let's see, as a direct candidate quotes, who is answering their phone and responding to email while interviewing them. Just some of there's more travesty in some of these interview events than I've ever seen. But the candidates that stated that they had a positive experience were the ones that felt that they were the most prepared. I think a phrase that came through the most was the candidate says, in this feeling of being a second-class citizen, created a negative experience. But the candidates that were given the profiles of the names that they interviewed with, given instructions, given a point of contact in order to help and support them through that experience so that they weren't caught off guard, were the ones that came back and said even regardless of getting the position, they would still be strong advocates of that company because of how well they were treated.
Wonderful. Okay, so it looks like we just have one more question, and it's actually about the report that you guys have put together.
Well, then I should go to the last slide for that. So you can actually download the report directly from our website. It's thecandes.org or thetalentboard.org. You can find out more information around the overall program. You can register for our workshops, which we're doing regionally, which are half-day events for people to have conversations around candidate experience. We also have the registration up for our symposium that's happening in the fall. That'll be a 2-day full candidate experience workshop. Most of the winners that you saw on the winner slide, those are the presenters for that conference, and we will be announcing the 2015 winners at that conference. And you can feel free to contact Jerry, myself, or Ed via Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, the website, or however you so choose.
Perfect. And actually, that last call pushed a couple of people to send in their questions. So with the last 2 minutes, I'll see how many I can get through.
Sure.
Dawn had a question. Is there an industry standard for what people disclose, what people share when they don't give the job to a candidate?
Great question. I think there's a lot of traction on this topic going on in the industry today. So how do you tell a candidate that they didn't get the job, I think is what the primary question is, and what you can disclose. Yep. We are starting to see a little bit of a difference in the winning organizations and that candidate response score on the organizations that are willing to tell the candidates a little bit more. So it is the baseline trend I've seen thus far is if you've only corresponded with the candidate through technology, they applied, you've responded via email, but you've never had a phone conversation with them, the response back to them that other candidates being more considered with an appropriate level of information is appropriate. If you've had a phone call or you've met them face-to-face, we've seen organizations set them mandatory that they deserve a phone call. If you can't reach them, then after 2 calls, a voicemail, then an email. But there's new standards on how they're communicated with. And it's answering the candidate's questions honestly. You can state that there's another candidate that's a closer fit, and there's 100 different ways to say that same thing. What we found in the organizations that have put themselves out there and made their recruiters available to the candidates is they didn't get an increase of candidates trying to position themselves to get the job, the greatest fear, the candidate that says, but wait a minute, I have that too. They found more of the candidates stating, thank you for the feedback, and being comfortable with being let go in the process just because they had a brief conversation. So that's one of the key elements. I think the second component is really think about the message you're giving the candidates directly in the emails that you're sending. So often candidates think they're the only person that's perfect for the job. It's appropriate for us as recruiting industry professionals to remind them that while we think we're going to review their information, they're one of, on average, 200 people that apply to the position. Not putting the candidate, so much in a negative position, but helping them to understand the sheer fact is that not 2 people didn't apply, 200 people applied. And the time and attention that's going to take us as an industry to respond to that is X. But whatever you put out there for your promise of when you're going to communicate, make sure you deliver on it. If you say it takes 2 weeks to do turnaround, make sure you're responding to them in 2 weeks. If you say it takes 24 hours, make sure you're responding in 24 hours. That's some of the core data we've seen so far.
Perfect. Okay, and we're actually 1 minute over, so I will let everyone go and end this webinar. Thank you everyone for attending today. Hopefully you got some really great information out of Elaine's presentation, and thank you to Elaine. One last thing is that we will be sending you the full slide deck and recording after we wrap it up here, and that'll be in your inbox by tomorrow. So look for that. If you have any questions, obviously use the contact information up on your screen right now. If you have questions for Jobvite, you can reach us on Twitter, on Facebook. You can email us at recruit@jobvite.com, and that's it. So thank you everyone once again, and hope you all have a great day.